What are the main themes of Rosh Hashanah? There were three of them. We already touched on one, Malchiot, Melech. Zichronot is memories. And Shofrot. Okay? Blowing of the trumpet. So if you were to look down on your cheat sheet, it's right there. What we're going to try to explore today, and the first part is going to be a little bit of a review of what we kind of did last year when we emphasized Malkhiot, the kingship, and how prominent it is. But we're going to move on a little bit further because we're going to try to answer the question of where Malkhiot entered our tradition and where it's emphasized, and where those other two themes, which personally, until I started kind of researching this, I never really got it. In other words, what happens during the davening, and Musaf especially, is there are three themes throughout the prayers. And if you notice, we stop in the middle of the repetition, or maybe during the silent portion of it, and the shofar is blown. And then there are 10 proof texts. So it says Malkhiot, it gives 3 texts from the 5 books of Moses, 3 texts from the Nevi'im, 3 texts from Tehillim and the others. And proving that Malkhiot, kingship, is a big deal in Judaism. Then it goes to memories. Zichronot does the same thing, and then to Shofrot. So this is a key theme within the liturgy. So what is the source in the Mishnah? So in the Mishnah, and I'll read it because it starts out a little complicated. One says avot, which is the first prayer of the Shemona Esrei. Then you say kedushat, and then you go into Malchiot, in the beginning of the Shemona Esrei, of the silent Amida. Then you blow the shofar, then Zichronot, and then he blows, and the Shofrot, and then he blows a third time. Second Mishnah says, we may not have less than 10 verses of Malkhiot, 10 of Zichronot, and 10 of Shofrot. So the Mishnah is a big deal, because the Mishnah is the first codification of the oral law. So this means that this was a practice, and this is the earliest reference to this theme, this tripartite theme. What it's saying is this was the practice, and it codified it. So both saying the proof texts and also blowing the shofar. But what's the source in the Torah itself? So believe it or not, there's no source for Malchiot. In other words, never when Rosh Hashanah is mentioned, or when Yom Kippur is mentioned, and many times they're taken as those 10 days are taken as one unit, is anything to do with kingship mentioned. However, there is a text in Leviticus that says, speak unto the children of Israel, saying, in the 7th month, in the 1st day of the month, shall be a solemn rest unto you, a memorial proclaimed with the blast of horns, a holy convocation. So in the Hebrew, it's zichron, which is here translated as memorial, and truah is blast of the horns. So at least we see those two later themes. Not a clue why, not a clue what they mean, but at least they're put together. And if anything, I would put a hyphen between them. It's zichron truah. It's almost a memory of the blowing of the shofar. What does Rashi say? A remembrance of scriptural verses dealing with remembrance and scriptural verses dealing with the blowing of the shofar. So I got a cheat sheet for you. So Rashi hits the nail on the head and says this is the biblical source for those 10 verses dealing with memories and dealing with the truah. So what happened to Malchiot? As we dealt with last year at this time, if you may remember, it's almost as though Malchiot itself really doesn't have to be mentioned. Why we choose Rosh HaShannah to really get into making God our king, that's a question we're going to try to answer. But in terms of Malchiot itself, we already did number 3, Modeh Ani. The first thing you would mention in the morning when you want to make a reference to God, you don't say God our Father, you don't say God the Blessed One, God the Merciful One, you say King. Melech Chai V'Kayam. Then you make a blessing, maybe 100 blessings every day. The formal, the way we say a blessing is, blessed are you, O Lord, our God. What's the adjective? What describes him? Melech Olam, King of the world. Once the high holidays come, we even start to change prayers. So we did this last year too. In this Shmona Esrei, the third blessing, Hashem Hakel Hakadosh, the great God, the holy God, we change that to Hamelech HaKadosh. So notice, we don't change any prayers to put in Zichron, memories, Zichronot. We don't change any prayers to put in Shofrot. But Melech, that's a big deal. Then, we talked about last year that the proof texts, and we're on 6 now, the proof text, when you do Musaf this year, and you go through those proof texts for Malchiot, for Zichronot, for Shofarot, you will find, with one exception, that every one of the proof texts is a real proof text. In other words, if you're talking about how do we know that God remembers, you bring a verse from the Bible, from the prophets, from the Tuvim, and it has the word Zichronot in it, or it has the word memory, that God remembered Noach. There's one exception. The 9th of proof text for Malchiot, for kingship, is one that's very recognizable to us because it's the end of the Olenu prayer. V'hoya Hashem lamelech al kol ha'oretz b'yom yeh yeshem echad u'shmo echad. In that day, God shall be king over all the earth, and the Lord is one and his name is one. That's the 9th proof text. 10th proof text, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. Anybody see the word melech in there? Anybody see the word king in there? So the transition is made by the verse before it, where it says that God will be king and his name will be one. But the point is, if those of us who believe that Shema Yisrael is like the pinnacle of Jewish dogma, the elevator speech of Judaism, this is really due interpreting the verse as much as bringing it as a proof text. What it is saying is, and if you talk about making God the king, we'll get into this a little more, is a slightly political statement. So what you're saying is that Shema Yisrael Hashem Echad, Hashem Elokeinu, God, he is our God, and he is one, means that he is our king. What we're saying is, defiantly, that God is our Melech, he's our ruler, he is the only ruler in the world, he's the only one that we answer to. What do we say right after? I'm up to 7 now. What do we say right after?
That's not a political statement at the moment that this is happening, back then.
Okay, get to 7. You're asking me, is it political or are you making a statement?
Both.
Well, I'm trying to let the verses speak for themselves and the liturgy speak for themselves. All year long, what do we do after we say Shema Yisrael? We say Baruch Shem Kavod Malchus. Okay? We say blessed is his holy name. His kingdom is forever and ever. It's whispered. You know, there are a lot of midrashim why it's whispered. They're beautiful midrashim. But if you ask me, if you combine this and the Olenu, both of these prayers almost has a subversive quality to them. The Olenu, the history of the Olenu, it was said for martyrdom. History of the Shema said for martyrdom. The idea was nobody rules us. It's the ultimate protest of a Jew stands only with his God, okay? And sure enough, the 10 days of between Rosh HaShannah and Yom Kippur, what do we do differently about this prayer?
We say it out loud.
We say it out loud, okay? It's almost as though we're coming out, okay? We are coming out. So I don't know if there's a political context to this or not. I do know that the Olenu has had verses taken out because it was put at the end of the service so that the spies who were there would have left by then. You know, these are all, who knows if they're true, but there's a controversy about both these verses because in a sense the people that wrote them and the people that said them understood what they meant. And that is defiantly saying that God is the only king. Okay? So we have a little bit of a quagmire here, dichotomy. On the one hand, Malkhiot it's like all over the place. And on the other hand, it's not mentioned in regard to Rosh HaShannah or Yom Kippur. And on the other hand, Zichronot and Shofarot, there's a kind of a small reference to it, but but certainly nothing to build a philosophy on or to merit changing a whole service of Rosh Hashanah. So, yes, Martha.
Question. Frequently referred to as father, not as king, but as father.
Beautiful. Avinu Malkeinu. Okay?
It's both.
We'll get to that in a second. Okay? Actually, yeah, that's 8. I missed 8. Thank you, Martha. So 8, Avinu Malkeinu, Ein Lanu Melech Ela Ata. So this was written by Rabbi Akiva. There was a drought, and we have a lot of Avinu Malkeinos. In the Talmud, there's 2 of them, and this is one. And what, again, emphasizing what we said, but admitting that it does bring in that he's a father too. The point is, not only is God our king, but we don't have a king other than you. And I would say, to answer your question, the atah is a giveaway. In other words, we call God personally. Okay? So it is a relationship with a king, but it's a very special relationship with a king. It's one of almost a child and a father. And that is part of the radical nature of when we Jews say that not only is God king, but he's the only king, he's the only one we answer to, and we're an Am Segulah, we're the chosen people, and we have a special relationship with him. So, at the end of last year's preparation, I ended with how the concept of kinghood was in fact corrupted within Judaism. And we all know the story, and it's memorialized on 9. If you haven't read it before, I would go to Samuel 1:8 and read the whole thing, because it touches you in the heart. The people come to Samuel, the prophet, and they say, we want a king like all the other people. And Samuel is very rejected. And God says to Samuel, he says, they have not rejected you, they have rejected me. Okay? And in Hebrew, the word is ki oti ma'asu. In Yiddish, you get the real sense of ma'asu, a miskite, something disgusting. They disgust me. They have thrown me away. Everything that I've done for them, and now they've hit the core of Judaism. They're now asking for a king. Go ahead and give them a king. And then, of course, he gives them all sorts of rules to protect them against that king. He can't have any horses. He has to write a Sefer Torah. All of that stuff in typical Judaic fashion, where we kind of curtail a problem to our credit. But ultimately, the idea of a human king was extremely distasteful. So now, let's talk about the new year. So the interesting thing is that Rosh Hashanah is not the only new year. So if you look at the first Mishnah, and now we're on item number 10, the first Mishnah in Rosh Hashanah says that there are 4 new years. On the 1st of Nisan, the new year for the kings and for the festivals. Now, by the way, the first month is Nisan. So whenever we say the year begins in Tishrei, as you will remember when we quoted the verse from Leviticus, it says the 7th month. Okay? So there was what the Mishnah is telling you here, and it's very important for contracts and for other things, is that the year begins, there's a fiscal year, there's exactly a fiscal year. So what they're saying is the new year for kings and for festivals. So Pesach is considered the first festival. Kings we're going to get to in a second, but ostensibly it means kings, of human kings. They're not on Tishrei. They're on Nisan. So what does it mean? So you always have to say in the contract, in the 4th year of the king's reign. Right? Well, when does king's reign start? So if he was elected, or anointed, I should say, in Adar, and a month passed, and Nisan came, that's year 1. So if you had a contract in Nisan, you would say in the 2nd year of the reign of King Yonah, whatever. Okay? So it's for contractual purposes. On the 1st of Elul, the new year for tithing of animals, Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Simon say on the 1st of Tishrei. On the 1st of Tishrei, the new year for years, for the sabbatical years, and for the jubilee years, and for the planting and for vegetables. On the first of Shvat, the new year for trees, according to the words of House of Shammai. But of course, we always go after the House of Hillel. The House of Hillel on the 15th thereof, otherwise known as Tu B'Shvat. So the winter is over when we have a little Seder, and we take out some carobs, and we celebrate Tu B'Shvat. It's the New Year's of the tree. The source of that is this Mishnah in Rosh HaShannah. So now, the Talmud goes back, and Rav Chisda said, they only taught that the year begins in Nisan. This is in regard to Jewish kings. But for the kings of the nations of the world, we count from Tishrei. Okay, so what Rav Chisda tips us off to is that actually Kingship and New Year are intricately combined in the ancient Near East. Okay? And that there were traditions for new kings being anointed in Nisan, and there were traditions of kings being anointed in Tishrei. And I read this book. It's probably the most formative book that I've ever read that changed my whole thinking about Rosh Hashanah. It's called Kingship and the Gods, a study of ancient Near Eastern religion. It was written by a guy named Henry Frankfurt from University of Chicago. And this much of the book is on Near Eastern kings. From here, it talks about New Year's festivals. And it describes what happens, and I have, written basically. So in this book, he talks about the Babylonian New Year, okay? And what happened on the Babylonian New Year, and you can look all of this up. You can go to Wikipedia. They have a page for Akitu. So first of all, there were 12 days of preparation, and the highlight of the thing. Now notice it was a time of purification, of renewal of vegetation. Remember that Elul thing about New Year's for the plants? Dramatic reenactments. It was at this time that the destinies of both gods and mankind were fixed, and the king began his reign on New Year's Day. Now there's a slight differentiation. They took traditions and they aggregated traditions over 1,000 years of both Egypt and Babylonia. There were points in Egypt's time where this service was only held when a king got changed. So a king died, a new king went in on Nisan and was made new king. There were times in Egypt history where the old king went in and became rejuvenated, reborn, judged, and appointed for his purposes. Okay, in Babylonia, which has the closest parallels to some things that we see in our services. Every year this happened. It was probably the most public festival. And basically, you can look it up, but there are 12 days. So I'm just going to read from some highlights of those days. Fourth day. During the epic of creation, we have a theme here. I forgot to mention, what about the theme of Rosh Hashanah and the creation of the world? Okay? So during the day, epic of creation, Amunah Elish would be recited. The Amunah Elish is most like... It depends if you're Ashkenaz or Sephardi. Enuma Elish.
Right, you said Amunah.
Okay, I know, because that's what we do.
I just know if it was supposed to be, that's what it was supposed to be.
Okay, did I mention, I know, if you look at number 11, Babylonian name is Akitu. In Akkadian, it's Reis Satim, which means head of the year. Rosh Hashanah, okay. The Enuma Elish is most likely the oldest story concerning the birth of the gods and the creation of the universe and human beings. It then explains how all the gods united in the god of Marduk, following his victory over Tiamat. The recitation of this epic was considered the beginning of preparation for the submission of the king of Babylon before Marduk on the 5th day of Akitu. It's skipped to the 5th day. The submission of the king of Babylon before Marduk, the king would enter to the... Henry, how do you pronounce that? Accompanied by the priests. They would approach altogether the altar where the high priest of the Esagila impersonates Marduk. Then he approaches the king, begins to strip him of his jewelry, scepter, and even his crown. On Yom Kippur, I want you to... I don't know, in the conservative Machzor, do we have the Avodah service where it goes through every step that the Kohen Gadol went through?
There's a big chunk of it.
We do have a big chunk. Listen to this. The Kohen Gadol was stripped of all of his ornaments, All of the ones with gold, because of the golden calf, we were told, okay? Maybe not so much. Strip him of his jewelry, scepter, and even his crown. Then he would slap him hard, slap the king. The altar would kneel and begin to pray, asking for Marduk's forgiveness and submitting to him, saying, I have not sinned, O Lord of the universe. I haven't neglected your heavenly might at all. Then the priest in the role of Marduk says, don't be afraid of what Marduk has to say. The removal of all the worldly possessions is a symbol of the submission the king gives to Marduk. When the priest returns the crown to the king, that means his power was renewed by Marduk. Thus, April would be considered not only the revival of nature and life, but also the state as well. So they did it in Nisan, okay? In Egypt, the said festival, what I'm trying to get to is in that world, if you were having a New Year festival, you basically were renewing the divine right of your king. It went hand in hand. You were celebrating creation, you were praying for the crops, and that's what drove the period of time that these festivals were at. Whether it's spring before the planting, whether it's fall before the winter planting. You were begging for the future, like our Thanksgiving a little bit, because our Rosh HaShannah this time of year goes right into Sukkot. Now, the ancient festival in Egypt perhaps had been instituted to replace a ritual of murdering a pharaoh who was unable to continue to rule effectively because of age or condition. They were held to rejuvenate the pharaoh's strength and stamina while sitting on the throne, celebrating the continued success of the pharaoh. So, I think what we have here is a pattern. We also possibly have a context under which it might not be so necessary to show kingship in the Jewish New Year, because its absence, at least the absence of the way it was celebrated in all of the existing mammoth cultures, was obvious to anyone who was there. So what do we have? Anyone who came from Babylon or Egypt to watch our services would first of all ask the question, where's the king? Okay, king's not even there, not a part of our service. The priest, in a sense, takes over the king's role as a supplicant for the people. You have very strong parallels. What happens to the king? Takes off all the gold, okay? Engages in a life-threatening situation in terms of going into Kodesh Kodashim and confronting God or going in front of God. In the very back I have some texts. There are traditions where they said they used to put a rope around his leg in case the guy died, and they'd pull him out. What I couldn't find is there's a strong tradition that many, many years into our being, the Kohanim were very much like the papacy. There were guys who were Kohanim who did not deserve to have that role. They were simply political appointees, so forth and so on. And the Kohanim, the other priests, would gather around him, much as they gathered around this king in Babylonia. And they would try to purify him. They would ask him test questions to make sure that he wasn't part of the wrong sect, like the Tzedukim, who didn't believe in the oral law. They would keep him up all night, and this I couldn't find. But I know they either poured water on him or they slapped him. I have to find that text. But there's a similar type of, I wouldn't say abuse, but this guy is a figurehead and our future is in him. But my point is, for those watching who were enmeshed in this context, it was clear what the Jews were doing. They were replacing the king with their God. Okay? And to me, that part of what I'm going to say is almost, I would say, look, the emphasis on kinghood throughout our prayers, heightened during Rosh HaShannah, I think that's a case that anybody can make. It's obvious, it's there, it's right in our face. The liturgy is telling us this. To go to the next step and to say that Rosh Hashanah, the new year, and praying for the crops and celebrating the creation of the world and God making order out of chaos, that was obvious within the context of the way Rosh Hashanah and these other holidays were celebrated by the Babylonians and the Egypt. I will say even the fact that what Judaism was doing, and that's the name of this talk, which is what's new in the Jewish New Year, is that would be seen by anybody as absolutely radical. That here was a people who was celebrating the New Year, that were praying for their crops, were praying for their future, were asking forgiveness for their sins, and they were doing it directly or through a Kohan, but definitely not through a political figure, definitely not through a king. Okay? So now the question becomes, when did the Rosh Hashanah itself become introduced as this holiday that we read about in Tishrei, blowing the shofar in Zichronot? Because nowhere in the Bible itself does it call it New Year. So there's a big discussion. What I would argue, and there are some that claim, nowadays, for the last 100 years, they say, well, if it's all in Deuteronomy, it must have come with Ezra and the scribes when they came back from Babylonia. So that adds even more to the fact that they were influenced on the one hand, but also rebelling against on the other. But I don't think you need to make that stretch. The scholars go in many different directions. So now I'd like to get back to what I believe is more what I discovered and what works for me this year about pulling this all together. There is another reference to blowing a shofar on, and we're at 14 now. 14. There is another reference to blowing a shofar on the 1st of Tishrei. And that's mentioned in that Mishnah, if you recall, because it talked about the sabbatical year, it talked about the Jubilee year. That's Tishrei. On Tishrei, a horn was blown. It's on the Liberty Bell. It's right there in Philadelphia. It says, and you shall call freedom throughout the land. So thou shalt make, we're talking Leviticus 25, thou shalt make a proclamation with the blast of the horn on the 10th day of the 7th month. In the day of atonement shall you make proclamation with the horn throughout all the land. So in terms of being loyal to the texts, the only reference to some sort of shofar blowing on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur is with regard to the Jubilee year. What happened on the Jubilee year? So you couldn't, every seven, there was a 7-year cycle, and 7 times 7 is 49. Yeah. Loans were forgiven. Slaves were freed. Land was returned to the original order. Okay? Again, a sense of, and we'll get to the slaves being freed, but even before we get that, a return to the order, because there's no boss. You're not my boss. There's only one boss. Things return back. So it goes on. That's verse 9. 15, and you shall hallow the 50th year and proclaim liberty throughout the land unto all the inhabitants thereof. It shall be a jubilee year to you, and ye shall return every man unto his possession. Ye shall return every man unto his family. 39. And if thy brother be waxen poor with thee, and sell himself unto thee, thou shalt not make him to serve as a bondservant, as a hired servant, and as a settler he shall be with thee. He shall serve with thee until the year of the Jubilee. Then shall he go out from free, he and his children with him, and shall return unto his family, and unto the possessions of his fathers shall he return. For they are my servants whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold as bondmen. For unto me the children of Israel are servants. They are my servants whom I brought forth from the land of Egypt. Okay? According to the Talmud, we're at 15 now, servants were formally freed on the 1st of Tishrei. They were allowed to remain at the home of their master to enjoy themselves for 10 days until Yom Kippur, when the trumpet was blown as a signal of their departure and for the restoration of the fields to the original owner. So even though the verse talks about the 10th, according to the Talmudic understanding, which either was legislating it or preserving prior practice, this 10-day period was intimately connected to this Shemitah, freedom, so forth and so on. So,
I just want to say before I go that when the 16th century English political philosophers were looking to create an alternative to monarchy and the divine
right of kings,
they went back to Leviticus, and the guys like Eric Nelson at Harvard claimed that that's the origin of the rule of law, that's where they based it. Guys like John Locke and others, Hutchinson, based it actually on the Hebrew texts.
Wow, amazing.
So, and he has a book, Nelson, called The Hebrew Republic.
Oh, wow. You're gonna look at that.
Forget about the Greeks.
Okay, so here's the final. Here's the final. Let's go now to remembering the shofar. What happens, and we all know this, if a slave doesn't want to go free? Exodus 21, if you buy a Hebrew servant, 6 years he shall serve, in the 7th he shall go free for nothing. But if the servant shall plainly say, I love my master, my wife, my children, I will not go free, then his master shall bring him unto God, and shall bring him to the door, or unto the doorpost, and his master shall bore his ear with an awl, and he shall serve him forever. What does Yochanan ben Zakkai, the great Yochanan ben Zakkai, say? Now, why was the ear chosen to be bored out of all the organs of the body? The Holy One, blessed be he, said, the ear that heard on Mount Sinai, for the children of Israel are slaves to me. Our verse, Leviticus 25:55, and not slaves to slaves. And then went and acquired a master for himself, his ear shall be bored. The Hebrew is Eved Avadim La'avadim. The idea is God is the only master. So why would you have another master who actually is a servant of God too? The king is a servant of God too. The rabbi is a servant of God too. There's no reason to serve anybody else. So Eric Fromm, in a book that I absolutely love, and I recommend it, I think it's still vibrant today, You Shall Be as Gods, writes in response to this service, obedience to God is also the negation of submission to man. So the idea is, and this has been going through everything we've been talking to, the subversive nature of saying that God is king is ultimately the flip side, which is saying that no man rules me. Okay? The idea of serfdom of God was in the Jewish tradition transformed into the basis for the freedom of man from man. God's authority thus guarantees man's independence from human authority. So to my mind, what connects Malchiot, Zichronot, the Shofrot, is the Malkhiot is that only God is king, and Zichronot Shofrot is remembering that shofar that we heard at Sinai, saying that we are avodim to God and not avodim to avodim. So anyway, that's what I'm going to be thinking this year. And Chag Sameach, a good New Year.
Yolenu Shalom Asanu Gogoye Ha'aretz. So it was made us separated us very constantly. That's a real affirmation that we are.
We're different. I mean, of course, humanists like Eric Fromm will say that what chosen people means is a people that chooses to be ruled only by God. So join the movement. You know, if you still worship another God, a king, you listen to another king, you're not chosen yet. You know, that's what makes our philosophy unique in the Middle East, in the ancient Near East, and whatever. It explains our very individualistic and revolutionary type character.
I call it Michigan.
Yeah, you know, it's the old joke. I think Golda Meir came to President Johnson, and he goes, "Oi, I'm the president of 200 million people," and Golda says, "Oi, I'm the prime minister of 6 million prime ministers."
Thank you very much.